When I was a kid, my uncle owned an antique shop and my parents would leave me with him when I didn't have school. During my 5th grade spring break, I was dropped off at 7:30 and picked up at 5:30. Sometimes I cleaned, sometimes my uncle would show me an interesting item, but most of the time, I played with his personal collection in the back area. He had all sorts of antique toys. My favorites were the tabletop pinball machines, but he also had a jack-in-the-box that dated back to the 1700s. He bought it the previous month, but wanted to show it to me before he sold it. Apparently, it came with an interesting story, one about a doctor having it made especially for an ill child who passed away shortly after. The family left his room as a shrine and spent much of their time praying over his bed. Soon, they began hearing noises during the night, only to find the boy's jack-in-the-box in a new position. I was fully into the story, gawking at this old toy in slight fear but complete awe, until my uncle burst into laughter and explained how many dealers made up stories to bolster the desire of a specific item. This was the 60s, by the way, so it worked pretty well back then. I was disappointed, but that didn't stop me from enjoying the toy itself. The original ones didn't have a hand crank. They were just boxes, and the puppets popped out when you opened them. I think the first one was made by a German in the 1500s, but don't quote me on that. My uncle's apartment was upstairs, and I was having so much fun that he offered to keep me overnight. My parents agreed, happy to save the extra trip, and I continued playing with all the best toys. Later that evening, I made a bed on the couch. I tried to ignore the extremely loud snores coming through the paper-thin walls. Sadly, my efforts were futile. Anytime I came close to dozing off, the steady snores would be interrupted by a sudden animalistic grunt that scared me back to reality. Sometime after 1, I decided to take my blanket and pillows downstairs to sleep on the floor, but once I began descending the steps, I heard a strange sound below. It almost sounded like a rat was dragging a trap along, so I went to check it out. After flipping on the lights, it stopped instantly, and I turned to see the jack-in-the-box lying on the floor, top open, with the puppet stretched out of it, as if it had been pulling itself along. My uncle and I had gone upstairs together, and we'd left the toy in the middle of the table. There was no way for it to have fallen off. As I stood frozen at the base of the steps, something small ran across the room behind me. I turned around in search of the source, but nothing was there. I was only looking away for a second, yet when I turned back again, the puppet's head was on its side, facing me. It made me jump backwards, and I tripped over something, I don't know what. I felt it when my foot rolled over the top of it, but I couldn't find anything afterwards. I got up to close the jack-in-the-box, like it was waiting to bite me. That's what it felt like, and I held the lid tight. I put it back on the table, and I set an old jar full of marbles on top. Then I ran upstairs as fast as my legs would carry me. All the while, I could still hear the faint snores coming through the wall. My uncle had slept through everything. It made me wonder what else he slept through. Just as I opened the apartment door, the same light footsteps came racing up the dark steps behind me. I practically threw myself over the threshold of the door. The steps came all the way up to the door before stopping right outside. And then there was just silence. I had engaged both locks, but didn't trust them enough to not hold the door shut as well. I guess it could have still gotten through easily enough, but when you're in that situation, you act based on instinct. You don't remember that a barrier can't protect you from an angry ghost or spirit or whatever. I didn't hear another sound that night. It was almost 3 a.m. when I finally worked up enough courage to sit down. I still never got to sleep, but I only had to lay there for 2 more hours, my uncle got up at 5. His awful snoring finally came to an end. A few minutes later, he came out of his room. He saw me sitting there, wide awake, asking how I slept. Since I was 10, I didn't exaggerate. Everything came spilling out of me like a rehearsed speech because I had been telling it in my head for 2 hours. Needless to say, he didn't believe my story and insisted that I only had a nightmare. I didn't push too hard because I knew that he'd think differently once we got downstairs, and he saw the jar on the box. Unfortunately, the jar was broken, and marbles were scattered all over, while the box remained sitting exactly where we had left it the evening before, not where I had just left it hours before. My uncle's logical conclusion was that I got up to mischief during the night, broke a jar of marbles, and made up a story to cover my ass. As an adult, I can look back and fully understand his point, but at the time, I really resented him for not believing me. I've had a few other experiences over my life, enough that I have no doubt something else is here with us. But nothing ever frightened me quite as badly as that creepy puppet. Several years ago, I worked at a value village on Evergreen Way when I was just released from prison for armed robbery. Value Village is a secondhand store, a good part-time job. It helped me maintain my sobriety. I was able to obtain a steady income and get off the streets after saving my first 2 paychecks. I met the only couple of people that have ever been kind to me there. My boss, Anthony, and my closing partner, TT, aka Little T or T. Rest in peace, T. This story takes place probably 15, 17 years ago, and she was as close to dust as you could get when I met her. The bad part, this value village was as haunted could be. I do believe that now. The city itself, it's a miserable mess. Maybe it was the city that was haunted, and the ghosts just waltzed around wherever. I'm pretty sure that every community has a well-off part of town and a poor part of town. This area is at the very tip of the poor spectrum. You can't get much more grimy than Evergreen Way. A random night, as a closer, is close to the end of the night. No more shoppers. I'm cleaning aisles and reorganizing the items that people decided they didn't want but couldn't bother to bring themselves to put it where they found it. T's out on a smoke break. I'm close to the front of the store. While I'm sweeping around the jewelry section, I hear a very familiar squeak. I look up, and I see one of the shopping carts slowly moving down an aisle 3 or 4 rows down. All of the carts had these long red poles connected to them to deter people from shoplifting or taking the carts altogether. I stand there, and I watch this thing squeak from one end to the other before coming to a stop. Again, I'm at the front of the store. I would have seen someone enter. Still, I say, "Hello?" But nobody answers, so I return to what I was doing. A few seconds later, when my back's turned away, a distant wheel began to clunk and squeak again. I spin around. I watch the same shopping cart, moving back just as slowly as it had the first time. That makes the hair stand up on my arms. Holding the broom like a katana, I walk to the aisle that the carts were sitting in. When I get there, the aisles are empty. Panning my head around, I quickly notice that a lot of shopping carts are slowly moving, coming to life. Moving in various directions in the aisle. I decided I didn't really want any part of what was going on there, so I turned around. This didn't help me from screaming like a child, though. As I turned to walk away, I could hear the carts escalating in speed behind me. I let out a yip more cowardly than I'd like to admit as I left the aisle with the carts. Right around the corner is T. I practically collided with her and we both screamed. She asked me what the hell I was doing running around and making noise. I told her straight up, those shopping carts are possessed. Without hesitation, I walked her over to turn the corner into the possessed aisle. Of course, they weren't moving. But that's when T says, "Yo, I know." Apparently, this has happened to her a few times. Why she never told me, I don't know. But now, she told me she'd practically been hit with these carts in the past, that they'd clipped the back of her legs one night while working alone. As she's telling me this, several red poles of several shopping carts begin to vibrate and shake. The two of us stood there, watching as the shopping carts continued to tremble. It was like an invisible force was forcefully trying to communicate with us through these objects. T and I exchanged a couple of glances, mine more nervous than hers. Even with the moral support of someone else, I didn't know what to do next. As the vibrations intensified, T suddenly spoke out. When I gave her a look like, "What the hell are you doing?" she told me that she knew this place was haunted. She said as much, and then she asked the ghosts to talk to her. Followed it up with, "What do you need?" I'll give her some credit. It took me from scared to entertained pretty quick. It's hard to say exactly what I believed in that moment, but I certainly didn't think I was going to be speaking with ghosts. T stuck out her arms in front of her, as if she knew what was going to happen next. To my personal astonishment, at the same time the vibrations ceased. The carts were becoming still. It was as if they were waiting for whatever T was doing. I noticed her eyes were closed. I watched as she took a deep breath and began speaking softly. At the moment, though, it just kind of looked like something crazy. Before I knew it, she was whacking me on the shoulder and whispering for me to close my eyes. So I did. And T was asking questions, whispering things and being still. Took everything in me to keep my eyes closed and show some patience. I heard the rustling of tags hanging on items nearby. The air felt different, and I couldn't help it. I couldn't keep my eyes closed any longer. I opened my eyes the moment I heard a faint whisper echo through the space. It was barely audible, but distinct enough for me to hear. It said, "Harper." Well, I thought it said Harper, but after scolding me for opening my eyes, T said that she was sure it said, "Help her." For a moment, we lightly argued about what the voice could have said, but I was feeling increasingly more uncomfortable. It's not like it was malevolence I felt, but I wasn't experienced in talking with ghosts. Long story short, I wanted to go home. In a series of whispers and my inability to distinguish T's from the spirits, I asked that we speed this along and get to finishing closing. T asked if I wanted to just go, that she would stay behind. I considered it, but she laughed, saying that all the whispers had subsided anyway, jokingly blaming me for scaring them away. That night, T told me about her various experiences in the store, and then she told me that if I could hear those whispers too, it likely wouldn't be the last time that I experienced something. And well, T, rest in peace, my friend, and though I know you're not around to know it, I don't know how these things work. You were right. Fast forward, I still live in the same town 15 plus years later, and the store itself still exists. I work for the company that's hired to do landscaping for this portion of the city, and one day over the last year I decided to pop inside to see my old boss. I wanted to see if he was working. He was always a great person. Wanted to chat with him as possible. Honestly, I just had this odd feeling to go visit him before leaving town that day. On my way inside, I see him walking from the back of the store. He gives me a wave through the glass windows. He smiles, and then takes a hard right, out of view. When I get inside, I don't immediately see him anywhere. I ask around. One gal doesn't even know who I'm talking about, but another one does. She asks how I knew Anthony, and I told her the whole story, and she regrets to inform me that Anthony passed away. Heart failure. He had died at work. I asked the gal if she was absolutely positive we were talking about the same guy, the same Anthony. She told me that he's the only one she ever knew to manage the store for multiple years. She repeated his last name back to me, and it was Anthony. So, who did I see? I looked throughout the store, hung around far too long, trying to see if anyone matching his exact description was in the store. No such luck. I've accepted that I saw Anthony. I can't explain it, but I can't very well explain what happened in that store with me and T either. And just because I can't fully understand it, doesn't mean it didn't happen. Thanks for reading. If you have similar experiences, I'd really like to hear them. Or I guess just know that you're not alone in yours.